Hello and welcome to the Home Screen Podcast. This is episode 27 and today we're going to be reviewing Hollow Knight Silksong. Yep, it's finally here. Silksong is finally out. It came out on September 4th after 6 years of waiting. I was a big fan of Hollow Knight. I was a little bit late to the party and I ended up playing it on my Switch a few years ago. But this time round I was straight on Silksong on release. I played it through on my Xbox Series X. This is going to be another solo episode. I don't have anyone with me today, so we're just going to jump straight into discussing Silksong. The short version is essentially this is one of the best games I've ever played. It's incredible. I've beaten the game and rolled credits. It took me about 34 hours to do so. At the time of recording, I beat it yesterday, so it's taken me 5 days since release to beat it, but there's still tons of stuff left to do, as we'll discuss as we get further into the episode. As always, we'll start with spoiler-free thoughts and feelings, then we'll move into talking about spoilers, and then past that we'll even talk about some of the strategies that I found to be pretty useful into the end game. So we'll start with the synopsis. You play as Hornet. She appears numerous times back in the original Hollow Knight game, and this game begins as she's being escorted, as a prisoner I believe, through into the kingdom of Farloom, before she escapes, waking up in Moss Grotto. You eventually progress up to the town of Bonebottom, a sort of base camp filled with pilgrims determined to make a holy pilgrimage to the citadel at the top of the kingdom. However, as you progress through the underworkings of the kingdom and begin to ascend a bit higher, you realise that there's some dark evil at work, ensnaring the kingdom and its inhabitants. So your mission is quite straightforward. Ascend to the top of the citadel, seek an audience with those in power, and investigate the evil at work. In that regard, I do think it is relatively similar to The Wizard of Oz, in that beautiful, simple aspect. Almost like you're trying to seek an audience with the Wizard of Oz himself. Personally, I love how the narrative is structured. It's a simple goal, you must ascend. I really enjoyed that framing device of the climb. All the villagers at the kind of base camp talking about making this holy pilgrimage. It feels kind of fabled in nature, reaching this mystical citadel at the very top. So from a gameplay standpoint, this has the same DNA as Hollow Knight in terms of its Metroidvania aspects, level design, map exploration, and more. However, the game's bursting with new features and improvements that build upon the foundation established by the original game. And this isn't me talking down on the original game, which Hollow Knight is fantastic. I'm just saying how this is a great evolution in my opinion. For example, Hornet's moveset is far more advanced than the Knight's. You unlock more of it as you go on, and this isn't a spoiler as much as you see it a lot in the trailers, but you unlock the ability to dash and grapple, and unlocking new attack patterns through the form of crests, which is another good addition. There are also late game movement tech that you unlock too, but I won't spoil those. The art and level design is breathtakingly good. Each new area feels distinct and different from previous ones, with areas bursting with vibrancy and colours and forests to dark, dingy, really in the guts of the kingdom. Again, keeping within the original game's DNA, this hand-drawn 2D art style, but there's so much detail and nuance within it. Just because it's hand-drawn 2D doesn't mean that it's simple in any regard. The levels are layered so cleverly that it really creates a sense of depth. Even though you are travelling along a 2D plane, there are multiple layers which make it feel like you're really in the scene. Another new feature that I think works really well is the wish system, introducing side quests in a fun but not too laborious way. They normally have a handful of steps, and the rewards so far of what I've experienced have always been worth it. They've built upon the fast travel system to make it more robust. I won't say who the character is that you interact with to do the fast travelling, but once you get to that point you'll be like, oh yeah, this is really nice. Another parallel, in this game you collect fleas, which are sort of similar to the grubs in Hollow Knight, only this time there's a more interesting and evolving story attached to them. Rather than just being a collectible for them to throw money at you, they actually serve a purpose, and it's quite nice to see how that evolves throughout the different acts. And something that's worth mentioning, which has been discussed a lot online, and I definitely see is valid, is about the difficulty of this compared to Hollow Knight. This is a much more difficult game in many aspects, even from the start. The bosses are harder, with often much longer fights, with enemies spawning mid-fights. You have fewer masks, and mask shards are much harder to find. And the fact that a lot of bosses, but also normal enemies and environmental hazards, hit for 2 masks of damage. So it does feel much more punishing, knowing that you have, 5 or 6 masks for the majority of the early to mid game, knowing that you only really have 3 hits before you need to build up your silk to be able to heal. And I guess the number one topic of discussion really is the runbacks are much longer with fewer benches in some of the harder areas. I do agree with that. That is valid criticism. The only thing I wish is that there would have been a few more benches in some of those mid-game and end-game areas to save on some of the time of the run back. It's particularly brutal in some of the mid-game ones. Although after a few repetitions, they weren't too bad in the end, but I can definitely see that grinding a lot of people's gears. And the last thing I want to discuss in this spoiler-free section is the music. I think this is one of the most accomplished and beautiful soundtracks in a game that I've ever heard. There's a few pieces in particular that left me speechless. If you're listening to this right now and don't think you're going to play the game, that's absolutely fine. And if you're not too fussed about spoilers, then please go on YouTube. At the moment, I'm pretty sure the whole soundtrack has been uploaded to YouTube, and have a listen. It's incredible. I've even been showing the soundtrack to some of my friends and family that aren't so much gamers, and even they appreciate that there are some fantastic scores in this. Okay, so that's the end of the spoiler-free section. So the TLDR is, it is an incredible game. I recommend you go and play it if you haven't started it already. And it's also incredible value for money. I believe in the UK it's like £14. For the amount of time and joy I've got from this game, that's unbelievable value for money. So I highly recommend you go and play it. Okay, now it's time to talk spoilers. And I mean a lot of spoilers. I'll be mentioning the final bosses, alternate endings and endgame areas. So this is your warning, okay? So I need to discuss some of these encounters and boss fights. There are a couple that had me stuck for a while, particularly Widow and the Last Judge. They were pretty rough, but once you understand the fight and the attack patterns, they were actually pretty fun to do in the end. I think Last Judge was still pretty stressful because it was quite a long fight, but Widow, you really got the hang of the rhythm of the fight. I actually really enjoyed it, even to the point where you could start to parry the bells. You really got a sense of mastery of that fight. I do think the hardest areas in the game were definitely some of the gauntlets, particularly the forearm gauntlet in the high halls and some of the platforming sections. The climb up to get the fade down cloak was pretty brutal. I think there's the starting bench and then the bench at the halfway point, but it was like a 5-10 minute reset sometimes trying to get back. I think the hardest section of the game, outside of optional endgame areas, is the quest at the end of Act 2 to collect all 3 melodies to get to the top. I actually found Lace and the final boss, Grandmother Silk, relatively easy, but I was helped out a lot by my build, which I'll discuss in a bit. There was one moment in this game which I want to discuss. I know I already mentioned Last Judge briefly, but the feeling of defeating Last Judge, that's the conclusion of Act 1, and entering the Citadel for the first time. The emotional payoff after such a stressful fight to be greeted with that sight and that cutscene was, I think, truly a special moment. That's one of those core gaming memories that I think I'm going to remember for a long, long time. There's such a feeling of grandeur and wonder, particularly when you get to the choral chambers. And that music track in particular, I think it's just titled Choral Chambers. I think it's probably my new favourite piece of video game music. It's so powerful and it pairs so well, especially when you walk through the halls at first before you encounter Lace briefly, and it's just this empty, echoey city with these choral vocals. I think that's one of my all-time favourite gaming moments. There's a few moments in other games as well which I think kind of get this, but this is the most powerful for me. Like when you reach Lindell, the royal capital in Elden Ring, when you reach the City of Tears in Hollow Knight, and I know there's a few other ones in Dark Souls, which I haven't personally experienced, but I know they're fabled as being truly special moments of reaching these grand cities. Again, another spoiler, I do know about Act 3, I know how to get to it, so that's what I'm going to be trying to do next. I'm currently exploring the Sands of Karak and the Putrefied Ducts, and then I'm going to be ticking off the fleas and the wishes to essentially enact the secret ending to get to Act 3. Okay, so now I'm just going to chat a little bit about strategies and routes that I found useful. I feel I did the pretty standard route up to the Citadel and did pretty much every optional boss that I came across, apart from the Four Brothers in the Deep Docks, and I believe it's called the Father of Flame in a Wisp Thicket. They were just really annoying to deal with the fire damage doing 2 massive damage, so once I eventually get the charm that reduces fire damage, I'll be taking them on. And I found a strategy that pretty much carried me for the last few hours of my playthrough was to get the Cogfly upgrade tool, which you can get just above the forearm gauntlet in the high halls, and the Sting Shard tool. Pairing these both with the Polyp pouch and the maximum tool damage upgrades, you essentially could rest on a bench, pop 4 Cogflies, sit back on the bench, refill your Cogfly meter, and then enter a fight or just enter a traversal area, and you never really had to deal with any minor enemies. Then in boss fights, they would just passively tick away. You could throw out 1 fly, it would do like 10, 15 hits of damage with the poison ticks, and then as soon as the ticks finish, you just throw up another one. It meant that I was able to beat the second Lace encounter on my 2nd try, and I beat the final boss Grandmother Silk on my 5th try. It could be seen as a little bit cheesy, but I think to get through some of this endgame stuff, you really had to use the tools that the game gave you. As of recording, they could nerf the Polyp pouch, I guess, in a future patch, but I think at the moment, if anyone's struggling, try that. Get the Cogfly if you're at that point in Act 2, and it honestly, it does wonders. The passive damage is extremely useful, and it means you can just focus on the fight mechanics while getting the occasional hit in here and there. Another thing I tried to do was every time I came across a shop vendor, I would just immediately fast travel away to farm rosaries to be able to buy their entire inventory. It probably added a few hours to my playtime, but it was nice downtime. I just took a podcast on or something, and I found it really helpful having different tools in my arsenal. Since beating it, I've begun to look at guides to see what else I'm missing, and it turns out I still have a ton to do and collect. So I'm looking forward to keeping playing to hopefully get to Act 3. I'm really not looking forward to doing that Courier's Rash quest, kind of like the White Flower quest from Hollow Knight, so I'm going to put that off till the very last thing I have to do. So we'll wrap it up there. In summary, I think Silksong is a masterpiece. I'm so glad Team Cherry took their time to make sure that it was polished before releasing it, because, like, goodness me, this is one of the most polished games I've ever seen. I read there was an interview article, I believe, with Jason Schreier, when he interviewed the devs about how long the development time's taken shortly after they did the release date trailer. And they basically said that they were just having so much fun making it, and that was why it took so long. And I have to say, it was absolutely worth the wait. In terms of Game of the Year, I still think that Expedition 33 will win Game of the Year, as it's such an accomplishment and essentially created its own genre. However, for me, Silksong is my personal favourite game that I played this year. I know that I said that about Blueprint and Expedition 33 in their respective episodes, and I don't want to sound hyperbolic, but I just think this is a very, very special game, and I've thankfully been fortunate enough to have the time to play this to the extent that I have during its launch week to get this review out within the week of it coming out. So I hope this review's been helpful. It took me a lot of time to pull together, but this was not arduous at all. I've enjoyed my time playing this, even the stressful boss fights and gauntlet encounters. I've really enjoyed playing this game, and I hope you do too. If you play it, I really hope you enjoy it. So thanks for listening to this episode of the Home Screen Podcast. Please give the podcast a follow or a subscribe if you haven't already. Give it a like, and if you check our episode descriptions, you'll see all our social media links. So thank you very much, and I'll see you the next time. Bye.